Masechet Menaḥot Daf Non Chet. We learned in a baraita above that any part of a korban that's supposed to be eaten, one may not place on the mizbeach. It's not supposed to be burnt. And we learned this from this pasuk here in 2:11. Kol mincha shetakribu ladonai lo taseh chames lo kichos avhot ebash lo tatenu mimenu. And from the word mimenu, we learned that if part of a korban is burnt on the mizbeach, then the rest of it lo taktidu. The rest of it is not allowed to be burnt on the mizbeach. And that applies to a whole bunch of things that were listed here. And now we're going to learn that also one may not put them on the ramp. Itmar, hama'ale mikulam al gabe hakebesh, Rabbi Yochanan amar hayab, Rabbi Elazar amar patur. So Rabbi Yochanan says that all of these items that we said cannot be burnt on the mizbeach, you cannot even put on the ramp. The ramp is also holy. It's the things that you put on the ramp are items that you're putting there to get ready, so that then you'll burn them on the mizbeach. But these things are not going to be burnt on the mizbeach, so they cannot even go on the ramp according to the Rabbi Yochanan. And he learns it from the word ha-mizbeach, which is in the next pasuk, korban reshit takribu otam ladonai, ve'el ha-mizbeach lo ya'alu Lereach nihoach. We'll see how he learns it exactly. Notice it says hamizbech and lo ya'alu. Don't even go up there. So that refers to the ramp. However, Rabbi Elazar says no, he's exempt. You're not allowed to put it on the fire itself on top of the mizbeach, but the ramp, one is not liable. Rabbi Yochanan amar hayav detanya hamizbeach enli ela mizbeach kebesh minayin. Rabbi Yochanan amar hayab detanya hamizbeach en li el hamizbeach kebesh minayin Talmud omar el hamizbeach lo ya'alu lerason. Rabbi Yochanan says one is liable, and the source is from a baraita that says hamizbeach. If I just had that word, I would know that you cannot put it on the mizbeach itself, but I wouldn't know that you can't put it on the ramp, and that's why he says, and to the mizbeach let it not go up. Go up is talking about the ramp. It cannot even go up the ramp. Rabbi Elazar amar patur ma'ita ama. What's the source for Rabbi Elazar, who says that one is not liable for putting these items on the ramp? Damar kera seor udbash korban reshit takribu otam hu derabe lach kebesh kemizbeach aval midi acharina la. Rabbi Elazar in essence agrees that the words lo ya'alu is referring to the ramp. That's true. However, the pasuk is not referring to everything, but rather only to seor udbash. And we're understanding seor to refer to the shteh halechem on Shavuot, which is made with leaven, and devash, not here referring to honey, but rather to bikurim. These items are they're brought to the Kohanim. However, they are not offered on the Mizbeach. They're not burnt on the Mizbeach. And so regarding them, it says, Korban reshit takribu otam hu drabelach kebesh kamizbeach. So regarding these items, the shteh halechem and bikurim, it says the word otam. Let's look again at the pasuk. Korban reshit takribu otam ladonai ve'el mizbeach lo ya'alu. So this korban, you bring them close to Hashem. You do, or you give them to the Kohanim. Kohanim will wave them, but they are not burnt on the Mizbeach. And not only that, not only are they not placed on the Mizbeach, or even lo ya'alu. So the specific prohibition about putting them on the ramp, according to Rabbi Elazar, refers only to shteh halechem and bikurim. However, all the other items, like a korban hatat, the edible parts of a korban hatat, the kohanim are supposed to eat, they're supposed to eat them. If you put them on the mizbeach, you violate. If you put them on the ramp, there is no liability, according to Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Yochanan, hi otam, my abid le. Now we ask Rabbi Yochanan, what are you going to do with this word otam, which is a limiting word? It only applies to these. Something only applies to this and not to something else. What is Rabbi Yochanan going to do with it? He's going to need it. The Baraita, will get to it in the next paragraph here. So we start the beginning of the Baraita. You might think, what if an individual wants to voluntarily bring shteh halechem? Shtei Halechem in the Torah is brought by the community on Shavuot, and it's obligatory. But what if an individual says, I feel like bringing Shtei Halechem? Can he bring it? And if he makes a vow, would we say, oh, that which has gone out of your lips, you have to observe, and yes, you can, and you have to bring this Shtei Halechem? Talmud Omar, Korban Reshit Takribu, Sibur Amarti Lacha Velo Yachid. But no, you can't because the Pasuk in Devarim says, this first fruit offering, you, plural, will bring. So that means it's referring to a communal offering, and an individual cannot bring Shtei Halechem. Yachol lo yehe yachid mebi she'eno mebi choba kayoseba, aval yehe sibur mebi she'mebi choba to kayoseba. Now the Gemara, but the Braita asks, okay, fine, maybe an individual cannot bring it because there's no such thing as an individual being mandatory to bring Shtei Halechem, so therefore they cannot bring it voluntarily either. But perhaps the community can get together and say, we want to bring an extra Shtei Halechem voluntarily, because after all, the community does have an obligation to bring it on Shavuot. So maybe if they want to, they could bring it also voluntarily. You might think so. Talmud Omar, Otam, Uma yesh lecha lehabi, Shtei Halechem min haseor, ubikurim min hadevash. That's why the Pasuk says Otam, meaning the community brings these only, the ones that are mandatory, obligatory, and not anything else. So what does that refer to? What do you have to bring? Shtei Halechem comes from Seor, the Seor is referring to that, and Bikurim comes from Devash here in the sense of fruits that are sweet. Those have to be brought, and that's it. You can't voluntarily, even as a community, bring Shtei Halechem. Shtei Halechem lo yakribu nedava. Okay, so that was the answer. That's what Rabbi Yochanan does with the word otam. But now that we brought up this topic of Shtei Halechem being brought as a voluntary offering, and that Braita just now said that the community does not bring it, now we have another Braita that seems to contradict this. V'atanya, im ne'emar kol seor, lama ne'emar kol devash. V'im ne'emar kol devash, lama ne'emar kol seor. So now we're going back to this pasuk here that says kol seor and kol devash cannot be brought on and burnt on the mizbeach. The word kol comes to refer to even a little bit, even half of a measure of seor. You cannot burn even half of a measure of devash. One cannot burn on the mizbeach. We ask, why need both? Just say one and I could figure out the other. So if it says already kol seor, just say that. I don't have to say kol devash. V'im ne'emar kol devash, lama ne'emar kol seor. And the answer is because there is a law that applies to seor that doesn't know how to apply to devash, and a law that applies to devash that does not apply to seor. Therefore, I would not be able to learn one from the other. What are these laws? Braita says, seor hutar mikelalo b'mikdash. V'devash lo hutar mikelalo b'mikdash. Seor, leaven, there is something that is permitted even with seor in the mikdash. There are korbanot, the korban minchas, they have seor. That is the Shtei Halechem and the korban todah. He brings 40 loaves, 10 of them are made as hametz. They're made with seor. So there is such a thing, as there are exceptions to the rule for seor, whereas devash has no exceptions. Devash here is actually referring to honey, and you never bring honey in on any korban in the mikdash. Devash hutar b'shiyarei Menaḥot. Seor lo hutar b'shiyarei Menaḥot. And the other way around also. There is a law that applies to devash, an exception, and that is the leftover. When you take a regular korban mincha and you take the kometz and you burn that. The rest of it, the kohanim eat. The kohanim can mix in honey with the leftover. They want to take those wafers, whatever, and dip it in honey. They can do that. Whereas seor, you cannot do that. You can't take the leftover of flour and make it into leaven. And so each one has a permission that does not apply to the other one. Therefore, the pasuk needs to tell us both. Braita summarizes and says, since there's a law that applies seor, not devash, and devash not seor, therefore the Torah has to say, any seor and any devash, even half a measure, you're not allowed to burn. Now the Gemara asks, Seor zuta mikelalo b'mikdash, ma'inihu, lav shetei halechem de karaba nedava, when it says that Seor is permitted in the mikdash. What is this referring to? Because after all, the Shtei Halechem and the Korban Todah, they're not offered on the Mizbeach, they're eaten. They're eaten by the Kohanim or by the owners, and so those are eaten and not actually burnt. So when the Baraita says that there is a case of seor that's permitted in the Mikdash, and you're permitted sounds like to burn on the Mizbeach. So what is that? Maybe it's referring to shtei halechem, that if the individual or the community brings it voluntarily, they can bring it, and if they do bring it, it would be burnt on the Mizbeach. So if in this understanding of the Braita, the community is permitted to bring a communal offering voluntarily of shtei halechem. But the previous Baraita said that no, individual nor community, neither of them can bring shtei halechem as a voluntary offering. So how do we solve this contradiction? Amar Rav Amram, lo, likareb imahem. Rav Amram says no. When it says you bring the exception that there are things of seor that are brought in the Mikdash, it's not referring to the shtei halechem ever. Rather, it's talking about the things that are brought with shtei halechem. Together with shtei halechem, you bring the communal peace offering, the shelamim, and part of that is in fact offered on the mizbeach. That's what it's talking about. That the part of the package of the shtei halechem, which is seor, is the animals, and part of those animals are burnt on the mizbeach. That's what it's talking about when it says those are exceptional. And therefore it has to mention them because there's no exception like that for devash. And here devash is referring to bikurim. There's no exception like that for bikurim. But now we ask about that. Yachi bikurim nameh ditanan hagozalot she'al gabeh hasalin hayu olot v'hasalim shebe'adam nitanim lakohen. If so, we're going to bikurim. Also, actually, bikurim should be the same. There is an exception for bikurim. In other words, if you're going to include things that are brought together with, then bikurim also has something that is brought on the mizbeach together with it, as it says in the Mishnah Masechet Bikurim, that these fledglings, these little birds, were brought on top of the basket. The basket contained the fruit, and when the farmer brought his basket of first fruit of bikurim, he had these birds on top, and the Kohanim would offer those birds as a korban olah. And the basket itself also would be given as a gift to the Kohanim. So we see here that for devash, there is an exception where there are cases where devash is permitted to be offered. Well, they're not the bikurim themselves; those are not placed on the mizbeach, but the birds that accompany them are put on the mizbeach. And if so, that's the same as shtei halechem. And you said before that there's a law in this that does not apply to that, but here, wouldn't this be the same? And the answer is no. Hanhu le'ater bikurim hu de'atu. Those birds are only coming to decorate the fruit. They're not actually part of the korban, part of the bikurim. If someone wanted to bring bikurim without the birds, they can. The birds are not in any way tied to it. If the birds got lost or whatever, then the bikurim are still totally valid. So they're not actually connected to each other. It's just a nice decoration to bring some birds together with it, but really they're not connected to it. And so, in fact, the bikurim does not have an exception like the shtei halechem does. Shtei halechem has the exception that part of the package is, in fact, burnt on the mizbeach, whereas bikurim, none of the bikurim themselves are burnt on the mizbeach. Ba'e Rami bar Chama me Rav Chisda hamale mi besar chatat ha'of al gabe hamizbeach mahu. Rami bar Chama asked Rav Chisda if someone brings the meat, the flesh of a korban hatat, that's a bird, onto the mizbeach, is he liable? The korban hatat of a bird, its blood is sprinkled on the mizbeach, but the rest of it is eaten by the kohanim. None of the flesh goes on the mizbeach. So here's the two sides of the question. Kol she mimenu la'ishim amar Chamana v'hayin mimenu la'ishim. The pasuk that is the source for the prohibition of putting things that are not supposed to be burnt on the mizbeach comes from mimenu, which means that if part of it is placed on the mizbeach and burnt, then the rest of it is not allowed to be placed. And here, none of it is burnt on the mizbeach, and therefore it would not be included in the prohibition. Or do we say anything that's called a korban, But those parts of it, or in this case the whole thing, is not supposed to be placed on the Mizbeach. If you do place on Mizbeach, then you're liable. As long as it's called a Korban, one is liable for placing on the Mizbeach parts that are not supposed to be there. And therefore, it doesn't matter that the Chatat Ha'of is entirely eaten and not burned, it's still called a Korban, and therefore it would be prohibited to put any part of it on the Mizbeach. That's the two sides of the question. Amar le kol shemo korban v'hainame shemo korban. Rav Chisda answers, no, the answer is B, that anything that is called a korban is within this prohibition, and this one is in fact called a korban. Ketana'eh. This question that he brought up is actually subject to machloket tanaim. Rabbi Eliezer omer kol shemimenu lahashim, Rabbi Akiva omer kol shemo korban. Rabbi Eliezer says that the prohibition to burn things on the mizbeach applies to anything where part of it is supposed to be on the mizbeach and part of it not. If you take the part that's not supposed to be there and put it on, one is liable. Rabbi Akiva, however, says no. Anything that's called a korban, but is not supposed to be burnt, if you burn it, then one is liable. My benayu. So what would be a difference between them in practice? Amar Rav Chisda besar chatat ha'of ika benayu. Rav Chisda says precisely this. Rav Chisda is the one that answered the question above also. And so he says that this would make a difference if you follow Rabbi Eliezer. That's only mimenu. So therefore, korban chatat ha'of would be excluded and not liable. But Rav Chisda, in his answer over here, was following the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who says anything that's called a korban is subject to this prohibition, and the chatat ha'of is called a korban. Another difference between them is the log of oil that's brought for a mesorah. That oil is used to sprinkle on the mesorah, but none of it is burnt on the mizbeach, and therefore, according to Rabbi Eliezer, since none of it is burned on the mizbeach, it's not included in the prohibition. But according to Rabbi Akiva, it is called a korban. And how do you know it's called a korban? The Tanei Levi kol korbanam lerabot log shemen shel mesorah. Pasuk in Bemidbar that lists all the priestly gifts says all of their offerings, and so the Midrash says that comes to include the log of shemen of a mesorah. That goes to the Kohanim. Whatever is not used, the Kohanim can keep. So it is called a korban, and therefore, according to Rabbi Akiva, if one would place that on the mizbeach, one would be liable. Tenor Banan seor bal taktiru en li ela kulo mixato minayin tamud lomar kol erubo minayin tamud lomar ki chol. So back to this pasuk that says Mkomen asher takribu l'Adonai lo tesachames ki chol seor vechol debash lo taktiru. So we learn from here that leaven, anything, in fact, that is hametz or honey cannot be burnt on the mizbeach. But it says extra words ki and chol. So what do we learn from here? When it says seor, you should not burn. So if it just had those words, I would know that a full measure of seor is prohibited. We'll see how much that is. How about what if it's half a measure? Mixatom minayin. So therefore it says kol, even a part of a measure. And what if it's a mixture, where you take the leaven and you mix it into other things, other dough, or whatever that's not leaven? Then how do you know that also is prohibited? It says ki chol, so that word ki comes to include even a mixture. Now we ask, my kamar, what does this actually mean? Amar Abaye, hachi kamar seor bal taktiru en li ela kezayit hasi chazit zayit minayin tamud kol erbo minayin tamud ki chol. Abaye is clarifying, what does it mean kulo? What does it mean a full measure? So it says as follows: seor, I only know a kezayit, so kezayit would be considered a full measure. How about half a kezayit? Therefore you have kol, and a mixture from ki. Rava amar hachi ka'amar seor bal taktiru en li ela komes chasi komes minayin tamud lomar kol erbo minayin tamud lomar ki chol. Rava is only disagreeing on one point, that a full measure is a kometz, and so if I had just seor, I would say fine, a kometz is prohibited, but half a kometz is okay. Therefore, it says the word kol to teach me that half a kometz is also prohibited. Okay, so now what's that? The essence of the machloket. The Rabbeya says it's a kezayit, and Rava says it's a kometz. V'mai kami palge. Abaye sabar yesh kometz pachot mishene zetim. Abaye, who used the kezait measurement as the minimum, he thinks that there is such a thing as a kometz that could be less than 2 zetim. Kometz depends on the size of the hand of the kohen. So it could have a small, big hand, small hand. But he says, even if he has a small hand, it's never going to be less than 2 zetim. V'yesh haktara pechuta mi kezait. And therefore, half of that is, if the whole thing is less than 2 zetim, half of it would be less than a kezait. And therefore, he says, okay, a full measure is going to be a kezait. How about half of that? Meaning less than a kezait. Less than a kezait is not a full measure. And so he says, this says the word kol to teach me even less than a kezait. So that's why he says kezait is the minimum amount. Rava amar en kometz pachot mishene zetim ven haktara pechota mi kezait. Rava, however, says no, even someone with a small hand, nevertheless the kometz is going to be at least 2 zetim. And therefore, there is no such thing as haktara that will be less than a kezait, because even half of a full kometz is still going to be more than a kezait. And therefore, according to Rava, the minimum amount is a kometz. And so the question is, how about half a kometz? That even that is still prohibited. And so because they have different opinions about how big is the smallest kometz, therefore they have different opinions about when it says kol, is it coming to include what? Less than a kezait or less than a kometz? The Gemara next teaches, Itmar hama'ale miseor u'midevash al gabe hamizbeach amar Rava lo kemishum seor ve'lo kemishum devash lo kemishum erube seor u'mishum erube devash. If someone has a mixture of leaven and honey and he burns it on the mizbeach, according to Rava, he will get 4 sets of lashes. One because it is seor, one has seor in it, one because of devash, another because a mixture of seor, and another because a mixture of devash. So this is following up on the previous derasha that each word that says ki is coming to include a mixture. So we have 2 separate things, that seor bal taktiru, and this also says devash o taktiru, and this is ki that includes a mixture. So therefore, each one separately requires a set of lashes, and because it's a mixture, and each one is a mixture of something of the other, so therefore you multiply it and you get 4 sets of lashes. Abai disagrees methodologically, and he says you do not get an extra set of lashes if it's a prohibition that's within a general prohibition. Here, there's only one basic prohibition of lo taktiru, don't burn, and then it says don't burn, and then it lists the things, you can't burn seor, you can't burn the devash, ki, you can't burn a mixture, but there's only one general prohibition. So you're not going to get added malkut for each subcategory, rather only one. Ikadamre hada mi halake, vikadamre hada nami lalake, taha la miyahad lave kelav de hasima. Within Abaye's statement, there's 2 interpretations. Some say that at least he still will get 1. This seems to mean 1. Of course, 1 for burning something, but plus, is it a second one? So 1 for leaven and 1 for the honey. And so, yeah, it's going to end up being 2, because those are the basic categories, even though it says lo taktiru, but the lo taktiru is applying to honey and leaven, and therefore it would be 2 sets of lashes. So when it says hada, it means 1 plus a basic one. There's got to be at least 2. That's one interpretation. But the other interpretation says, no, hada, even that added one, he does not get. Why? Because unless a pasuk comes and says that it has to be something special, like an individual particular act, for example, muzzling an animal. This is the pasuk about do not muzzle an ox while it treads out on the grain. You have to let it eat while it's working, is back to back with the law about lashes in general. So that's the paradigm, and that is a one specific action, and therefore you get lashes for one specific action. But if you have a pasuk, and then the pasuk includes multiple things, lo taktiru, and here's a few things, then that's not specific enough. And therefore, you're not going to get lashes on the seod and also the devash, but rather only on one for the generality. That's one interpretation of this. You could interpret this also that hada, even one at all, so that according to Abaye, he says, no, you don't get malkut for lav shebechlalot. The first ikadamid would say, no, you do get one for the entire thing, not two, but one, because you violated lo taktiru, and that includes whatever you burnt, mixture, one thing, the other thing, one generality. So you do get lashes for the generality. The other interpretation would be that you don't get lashes at all, 0 lashes, because in this interpretation of Abaye, one only gets lashes when the Torah says one specific thing that you do to violate, then you get lashes. But here it says lo taktidu, and it lists a number of things. So then, what is it? This one or that one? So maybe there's no lashes at all, according to Abaye. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.